Harry Dexter White, American economist and founder of the International Monetary Fund, sits before the Un-American Activities Committee on August 13, 1948, to refute the accusation that he was a Soviet spy. He had been in regular contact with the Soviet government while negotiating the landmark Bretton Woods Agreement, which fundamentally changed the world financial system. But Russia was an ally of the US in World War II. White insisted that everything he did for his country.
I should like to state at the start that I am not now and never have been a communist.
He was questioned intensely by 35-year-old Richard Nixon, who had just won his first election to federal office. Perhaps due to the stress of this encounter, White was found dead of a heart attack 3 days later. White is rarely remembered today. If you named a Soviet spy from this time period, you'd probably say Alger Hiss. But as an economist, White was far more influential. From 1947 to 1971, the Bretton Woods monetary system, which White created along with British economist John Maynard Keynes, would guide the free world to a new prosperity, perhaps the greatest ever in world history. This prosperous era came to an end on August 15, 1971, when President Richard Nixon slammed the gold window shut forever. Tell me, what would you do if you had all the money in the world? This fortunate position is essentially where the United States found itself at the end of the Second World War. And I'm not exaggerating much. Every other major power had been devastated. By contrast, the US mainland was untouched. The US economy was at full employment with a massive trade surplus, as large or larger than perhaps any other in world history. As a consequence, the Americans ended up with a huge stockpile of gold and other assets, which were kept safe in Fort Knox and at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. At that time, the US dollar was the only major world currency still backed by gold. In 1944, every Allied power had signed the Bretton Woods Agreement, which officially crowned the dollar as the world's reserve currency, replacing the British pound. This is a big deal. It meant that these countries saw the dollar as equivalent in every way to gold itself. This gave the US enormous financial power, but it also came with an important responsibility. At that time, 35 US dollars would get you 1 ounce of pure gold. This fixed exchange rate was basically an arbitrary number set by President Roosevelt and Congress back in 1934. But it was written into the World Agreement of the International Monetary Fund, which is one of 2 Bretton Woods institutions, together with the World Bank. That meant $35 an ounce may well have been written on stone tablets brought down from the mountain. The US gave a solemn pledge to uphold that exchange rate and keep the dollar convertible to gold essentially forever. In return, every other country in the free world pledged to peg their currencies, not directly to gold, but to the dollar. Currencies weren't supposed to vary in value by more than 1% in either direction. At least, that's how the Bretton Woods system was supposed to work. But the major problem in 1947, when the system went into effect, was that the only country that had any dollars was the United States. Again, Japan had been devastated, and Germany was almost completely destroyed. People there had nothing. They were starving, while the US had everything. US officials realized that in order to revive the world's economy and to stop the spread of communism, they had to share the wealth.
The truth of the matter is that Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years of foreign food and other essential products, principally from America, are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos.
In 1947, George Marshall championed a plan to send an astronomical $13 billion of aid to Europe. And that was back when $1 billion was a lot of money. $1.4 billion went to Germany, the country we just defeated. Later, the US sent $6 billion to Asia, including $2.4 billion going to Japan. This had never happened before in world history. Usually the defeated countries would pay the winners, not the other way around. But the Marshall Plan wasn't motivated purely by altruism. Congress only agreed to this massive transfer of wealth in 1948 after the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia seized power in a coup d'etat with the support of the Soviet Union. Greatly ramping up foreign aid was the start of what economist and author Yanis Varoufakis calls the Global Plan. This plan, drafted by former New Dealers, was designed to contain communism and to protect capitalism from another economic collapse like the Great Depression. Specifically, the US had chosen to build Germany and Japan up from the ashes and to use them as pillars to hold up capitalism in their parts of the world. And of course, any money the US spent would ultimately come back home in the form of a large trade surplus. Once the factories of these two former enemies were rebuilt with American help, Germany and Japan were expected to have trade surpluses of their own. That meant they needed markets for their goods. France and other Western European nations were intended as Germany's primary market, while China was intended to be Japan's primary market. This plan got more difficult after the Communists finally won the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Okay, so Korea then? Oh. How about Vietnam too? But I digress. Overall, the global plan was a huge success. There were no uncontrolled recessions or economic panics from 1947 to 1971. Things were stable and prosperous, not only for the US and the Allies, but also for the former Axis powers. Domestically, the US embarked on the New Frontier and Great Society programs of Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Baines Johnson, which cut the poverty rate in half in the 1960s. Civil rights were expanded as LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and the Fair Housing Act of 1968. LBJ also created the immensely popular Medicaid and Medicare programs, along with the Head Start early education program.
So even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
The Great Society programs were effective and are still very popular today. But there was a price tag. In the early 60s, JFK was already worried about the expanding US budget deficit. While the US had to help rebuild Europe and Japan, if for no other reason than to make sure these countries had dollars to spend, by the 60s, the rest of the world had enough dollars to stock their financial reserves. Germany and Japan were on their feet again and were becoming economic powerhouses. German and Japanese factories were brand new and state-of-the-art. That meant they could produce goods at a lower cost than the US could, making them more competitive in global markets. So, JFK saw the US trade surplus shrinking. The surplus wasn't enough anymore to cover all foreign aid, military expenses, and investment overseas by private businesses, all things that caused dollars to flow out of the country. Remember, every dollar outside the country could potentially be exchanged back for gold. Hey, JFK, do we have enough gold in reserve for that?
It is true that since 1958, the gap between the dollars we spend or invest abroad and the dollars returned to us has substantially widened. This overall deficit in our balance of payments increased by nearly $11 billion in the last 3 years, and holders of dollars abroad converted them to gold in such a quantity as to cause a total outflow of nearly $5 billion of gold from our reserves. All this is cause for concern, but it is not cause for panic, for our monetary and financial position remains exceedingly strong.
In 1961, the US had about $20 billion of gold in reserve. Still, it was a little concerning to JFK's economic advisors. Economist James Tobin suggested that maybe it was time to consider devaluing the dollar. That meant that $35 wouldn't get you an ounce of gold anymore. Maybe it would take $38 or $40. After all, the last time the gold value of the dollar had been changed was in 1934, and there had been a bit of inflation since then. As sensible as that is, it's something you just didn't say. JFK flatly rejected it.
We need not, and we shall not, take any action to increase the dollar price of gold from $35 an ounce. This administration will not distort the value of the dollar in any fashion, and this is a commitment.
Another advisor, John Kenneth Galbraith, added that he wasn't sure it would even be possible to devalue the dollar without a new international agreement. There was no provision for that in the articles of the IMF. Galbraith then suggested another solution that was also almost unthinkable: cutting military spending. In the early 60s, the US was spending a lot of money on military bases in Europe to defend against the Soviets. While this did cause dollars to leave the country, Secretary of State Dean Rusk fiercely objected to this idea, saying that the US military commitment in Europe was unshakable. In fact, overseas military spending by the US would ramp up dramatically throughout the 60s as the Vietnam War intensified. There was only one option that the JFK administration would accept. That was capital controls on US corporations. That means the government would discourage or outright block businesses from moving money outside the country. Like the military, businesses also spend money overseas when they make investments. You could make that illegal. Capital controls were allowed at Bretton Woods exactly for this reason. If countries maintain a fixed exchange rate with other currencies, and also have the freedom to stimulate their domestic economies in times of recession, then the free movement of capital sometimes has to be curtailed. This was the compromise they struck at Bretton Woods, because the founders of that agreement knew you can't have all three of these for long. This is called the impossible trinity of economics. The US was in a position where they had to either give up domestic control of their economy and cut spending, or raise interest rates to attract foreign capital, or they could devalue the dollar and lower the exchange rate with gold, or they had to stop capital from leaving the country. One of those was mandatory, or Fort Knox would eventually run out of gold. So JFK reluctantly agreed to capital controls, even if some corporations didn't like it. These controls started off pretty weak, so in 1967, LBJ strengthened them. But by that point, it didn't even matter. The US was spending money hand over fist in Vietnam. Over 58,000 Americans died as a result of that war, along with 1 or 2 million Vietnamese. The moral atrocity of it is unimaginable. And it wrecked the US balance of payments. There was now an ocean of dollars floating around outside the country, just waiting to be converted to gold. Fort Knox had nowhere near enough. And by the time Richard Milhouse Nixon became president in 1969, the US trade surplus had shrunk to basically zero due to increased competition from Germany and Japan. It was a dire situation. The US Undersecretary of the Treasury for International Affairs, a man named Paul Volcker, compiled a report for Nixon very early on in his presidency at the request of National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger. On June 23, 1969, Volcker told Nixon that US gold reserves stood at $11.2 billion, almost half of where it was in 1960. If they did nothing, the world monetary system would suffer a catastrophic breakdown with unforeseen consequences. And that would happen well before the last gold bar left Fort Knox. Countries around the world knew the US didn't have enough gold to cover their paper dollars. At some point, maybe soon, a run on the dollar was inevitable. No one knew exactly when this would happen, but Volcker drew a red line at $8 billion in reserves. At that point, they would be forced to break the promise they made to the world at Bretton Woods and go off the gold standard. Volcker encouraged Nixon to start negotiating systemic changes to Bretton Woods with other countries. The other option, he said, would be to devalue the dollar. But that felt like a line you just shouldn't cross. This was a very difficult and challenging position for a new president to find himself in. A dedicated and inspiring leader might, just might, be able to find his way out of this mess, but it wouldn't be easy. Given the options that Volcker laid out, how would Nixon respond?
Good job. Keep me posted on where we stand.
Then he got up and walked out of the meeting room. Later, he would tell his chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman,
I do not want to be bothered with international monetary matters. Problems should be farmed out.
Nixon was focused on other issues, like opening up relations with China and getting reelected. He didn't really care about Bretton Woods. And others in the administration, people like George Shultz, Nixon's budget director, actually wanted Bretton Woods to fall apart. Shultz was part of the conservative Chicago School of Economics, where he was a close friend of Milton Friedman himself. Friedman and Shultz wanted the government to stop trying to regulate the economy. And when it came to money, they wanted to switch from fixed to floating exchange rates, where the price of the dollar would be determined day by day or hour by hour in the free market. This is different from a system of fixed rates where the value of a currency is determined and maintained by the government that issues it. Schultz even invited Nixon's Treasury Secretary, a man named John Connally, to his house to meet Friedman in person. But Connally was like Nixon and didn't really have any strong feelings about economics. In fact, he didn't even know much about it, which is why he relied heavily on Volcker, who was hardworking and brilliant. And tall. Can we talk about how freakishly tall Paul Volcker is for a second? Volcker was a strong supporter of Bretton Woods and of fixed exchange rates. He wanted to do anything he could to save the system from collapse, which wasn't much given Nixon's disinterest. By the summer of 1971, the U.S. trade position in merchandise had fallen from a surplus to a deficit of $600 million, the first deficit since 1893. Rumors started flying around Europe that the U.S. was preparing to devalue the dollar. Volcker saw the crisis that was brewing and made a new, more aggressive plan, which Connally explained to Nixon in the Oval Office on August 2nd. But Nixon still hesitated, worried that any drastic action might hurt his chances for re-election. Connally insisted that doing nothing was not an option anymore, and besides, he thought they could frame this positively to voters. Probably feeling a bit frustrated, Connally left D.C. to take a break at his ranch outside San Antonio, Texas, with Nixon still undecided. In the week of August 9th, 1971, as Nixon hesitated, $3.7 billion of investment capital fled the U.S., looking for a more profitable home in a surplus country. Then, on August 12th, Britain sent a strange and somewhat cryptic message to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, asking them to insure a portion of their dollar holdings against a potential dollar devaluation. What did that mean? Did Britain want their gold back? Fear started to spread through the administration.
We were on the brink of a market panic that willy-nilly would force us off gold. If we were going to take the initiative, the decision would not wait.
Volcker urgently dialed Connally, saying that he might want to get back to DC. Connally immediately flew back and headed straight for the Oval Office. Nixon had finally decided to act. From there, they flew by helicopter to Camp David, the presidential retreat in the mountains of North Maryland. There, Nixon's economic team assembled, including Connally, Volcker, Schultz, Haldeman, and Arthur Burns, the chair of the Federal Reserve. Interestingly, neither Secretary of State William Rogers nor Henry Kissinger were even informed about this trip. Nixon's team debated all weekend, with their roadmap being Connally and Volcker's contingency plan. Connally took the lead in the discussions, laying out an ambitious set of policies sure to make a huge splash in the media. The plan would include 1. A tax credit to stimulate business investment and hopefully make American goods more competitive. 2. A 10% import tax or tariff. 3. Removing a tax on car sales to encourage buying American. 4. Closing the gold window, temporarily. And 5. A cap on all wages and prices. This would prevent the inflationary parts of this package from having an effect before the election. When he first heard this plan, Nixon was shocked.
I knew that by nature. Connally always favored the big play, so I would have expected he would recommend something bold. But even I was not prepared for the actions he proposed. He urged, in effect, total war on all economic fronts.
No one was completely comfortable with this plan. Schultz hated the idea of wage price controls. Burns strongly opposed closing the gold window, saying that the fear everyone felt was unjustified. And Volcker, even though this was essentially his plan with a few tweaks, he was distraught.
Volcker was undergoing an especially searing experience. He was schooled in the international monetary system, almost bred to defend it. The Bretton Woods Agreement was sacrosanct to him. Yet here he was participating in the overthrow of all he held permanent. It was not a happy weekend for him.
I hate to do this, to close the window. All my life, I had defended exchange rates, but I think it is needed. But don't close the window and sit. Let's get other governments to negotiate new rates.
Connally trusted Volcker. They had a close relationship. But he didn't quite see things the same way. After the plan was made public, Connally addressed a group of outside economists at the U.S. Treasury.
Well, it's simple. I want to screw the foreigners before they screw us.
I'm just gonna put this here. On the night of Sunday, August 15th, interrupting Bonanza, Nixon explained his economic package to the nation in prime time.
Good evening. America today has the best opportunity in this century to achieve two of its greatest ideals: to bring about a full generation of peace and to create a new prosperity without war. Prosperity without war requires action on three fronts. We must create more and better jobs. We must stop the rise in the cost of living. We must protect the dollar from the attacks of international money speculators.
Nixon didn't talk about closing the gold window until halfway through his 18-minute speech.
In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
This was an incredible shock to people around the world. Nixon broke a promise that the U.S. had kept for decades. And he told foreign world leaders and central bankers about it just minutes before he went on TV. Suddenly, they didn't know what their country's reserve assets were worth anymore. And the 10% tariff added insult to injury. Is America starting a trade war? Back at home, the speech was an enormous success. 46 million Americans tuned in, or about a quarter of the country, and reactions were overwhelmingly positive.
Good evening. Around the world today, people were wondering how their lives would be changed by President Nixon's far-reaching new economic program. In one place, the New York Stock Exchange, there was no doubt. Traders on the floor literally roared at the starting bell, and by the close, they'd had their busiest and best day in history.
After the speech, Volcker took a deep breath and prepared to leave the next day for Europe. For him, this was the start of 4 months of intense negotiations. In the days that followed, stock markets rose in the US but crashed around the world. Japanese stocks lost 20% in 1 week. After 2 weeks, governments in both Europe and Asia gave up trying to maintain the value of their currencies. They had no choice but to float and let the market decide. The dollar was also technically floating, but it just sunk, and no one was sure where the bottom would be. On his trip to Europe, Volcker took a lot of questions, but he didn't have a whole lot of answers. How long would the dollar float for? When would the gold window reopen? Has the US given up on free trade? These issues hadn't been discussed in detail at Camp David. The French were especially upset. Back in the 60s, French finance minister Valéry Giscard d'Estaing famously accused the United States of having the, quote, exorbitant privilege to be able to print money in large amounts without suffering the consequences. Because the dollar is the world's reserve currency, there's an almost unlimited appetite for them abroad, just like there would be for gold bars. And if he was upset back then, he was livid now. D'Estaing urged the US to devalue the dollar, then tighten their belt and use the power more responsibly going forward. The negotiations kept going into September and came to a boiling point at the meeting of the Group of 10 Nations, or G10, in London. Connolly took the podium to speak to the assembled group of European finance ministers, a tough crowd. Bluntly, Connolly explained that he was expecting a $13 billion swing in the US trade balance that Europe would be paying for. Just as shocking, he took US devaluation off the table and said it was up to Europe to make all of the necessary changes. Exactly what changes? He didn't say.
We have not come here with any precise plans or details worked out. The dollar may be our currency, but it's your problem.
According to Connolly, the rest of the world was freeloading on past US generosity and on the military shield they continued to offer against communism. He was essentially demanding that the Europeans reverse the US trade deficit while also funding US military operations overseas in perpetuity. And hey, I'm an American. I think there's some truth to what Connolly was saying, but he wasn't exactly diplomatic about it. This is when Kissinger got involved again. He told Nixon,
"We are uniting all those countries against us by not telling them what we want. If we screw everybody in the free world, we will then undermine the whole structure of free world competition. Texans hate foreigners. They think that the way to make a deal is to get the other guy by the balls and squeeze."
Nixon knew that this couldn't go on for much longer. He had a big trip coming up to China, which was a huge deal for him politically. It was time to get this currency stuff sorted. He set up a one-on-one meeting with French President Georges Pompidou on the Azores, a group of islands about halfway between France and the US. The idea was to hammer out an agreement and then get France, America's biggest critic, to convince the rest of the world. Kissinger took center stage during these negotiations, sidelining Connolly. To Kissinger, this was about foreign policy and maintaining America's alliances in the Cold War. A deal needed to happen. Nixon agreed to devalue the dollar so that 1 ounce of gold would be worth $38 instead of $35. He said he'd do what it took to defend this new exchange rate. He also agreed that he would drop the tariff if Germany and Japan agreed to revalue their currencies upward. Nixon did not agree to reopen the gold window, but he said they could discuss that at a future international summit. Similarly, Pompidou agreed to trade negotiations at a future summit and to discussions about contributing more to the collective defense as part of NATO. The G10 met a few days later in Washington, D.C. at the Smithsonian to hammer out the final details. Germany agreed to revalue the Deutschmark upwards by 13.57%, and Japan agreed to revalue the yen by 16.9%. Nixon dropped the tariff, and everyone was happy. Nixon announced the good news to the press in the National Air and Space Museum, right in front of the plane the Wright brothers flew.
It is my great privilege to announce the conclusion of the most significant monetary agreement in the history of the world.
Volcker leaned over and whispered to a colleague,
I hope it lasts 3 months.
The Smithsonian Agreement was a band-aid on a fundamentally broken system. Nixon had no interest in doing the work it would have taken to put the pieces back together. Once the crisis was over, he stopped paying attention again.
Good evening from CBS News Election Headquarters. Some or all of the polls have closed now in a dozen states, and the early returns put President Nixon, as expected, out in front and by a sizable margin.
As the months went by, it became clear that the U.S. wasn't holding up their end. Nixon kept running higher and higher deficits while the Federal Reserve cut interest rates to get him reelected. That's the opposite of what he promised in the Azores. Volcker then had to go negotiate another 10% devaluation to try and patch up the Smithsonian Agreement, which was a patch on Bretton Woods, and it seemed like this would have to keep happening forever. In violation of IMF rules, countries just started floating again. It's easier that way. The final shoe dropped on October 16, 1973, when OPEC almost doubled the price of oil. Then, that December, they quadrupled it. This led to enormous riptides in the world economy, flooding money away from oil-poor areas and into oil-rich OPEC countries. Bretton Woods just wasn't designed for this. In the Jamaica Accords of 1976, the IMF changed their rules to legalize currency floating. The official price of gold was formally abandoned here, and the gold window never reopened. But hey, why am I so gloomy? Floating exchange rates aren't so bad. They're the system, or non-system, that we have today, right? Yes, but the last time exchange rates floated, in the 1930s, there were terrible trade wars, and the world broke down into isolated blocks. It was a complete mess that helped lead to World War II. People like Paul Volcker were terrified of that happening again. But it was fine. There are no trade wars today. I mean, except for that one, that really big one that's happening as I write this. With the exception of double-digit inflation in the 70s, things were mostly fine for a long time, especially for America. When the dust settled, the US was left with all the power of the world's reserve currency and none of the responsibility. When American corporations took a look around in the early 80s, they realized that the shackles of Bretton Woods had fallen away. Capital controls were gone, and they weren't coming back. They started to look outside the US for the first time in a while. A new age was dawning. For some, a new golden age. Welcome to the age of neoliberalism.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.